So again, I'm hoping this doesn't take super long. This is absolute value inequalities. Inequalities, one of the phrases I teach is called the land of and that's about that in step 4. But it's one of those things that it helps you check your work, but it doesn't. I think you can get the answer without that, and that's kind of the battle I always fight with. Which one do I want to tell you? Because again, I think at the very least it does help you check your work, and it does make great. So when you're solving these inequalities, it is a little bit different since it's absolute values. Step 1, make sure the absolute value is all by itself on the left-hand side. Make sure they're all by themselves on the left-hand side. I will always put the absolute value on the left. I want to deal with that. But again, just like yesterday, make sure it's all by itself. Step 2, make 2 inequalities just like we did before, where we have a positive answer and the negative answer. But the biggest thing you have to remember that a lot of people forget is you have to flip your sign with your negative answer. So when you have your positive answer and your negative answer, you have to flip your sign, just like when you divide by negative. And I would love to go into why you have to do that. But really the best idea or the best thing is to, if you are curious why, just experiment with that and see what happens when you don't do that and stuff like that. So that's going to be better than me explaining, and it's going to waste less class time. Step 3, then, you solve the inequalities like usual. Remember, if you multiply and divide by a negative, you still flip your sign. And the last step, travel to the land of Gore. And again, that's just a way to remember how you correct that. So moving on to elaborate on that. Gore represents, if an absolute value is less than the answer, it's an and problem. So the L stands for the less, and then the and, land, is an and problem. So if you ever have an absolute value that is less than, so for instance, what that's going to look like. So if you have an absolute value of like 2x is less than your answer, it's less than 10, that isn't going to be an and problem. So whenever you're done, you're going to have an and in there, and your graph is going to be the typical and problem, which we'll talk about in a second, but that's going to be shaded in between. So if it's less than, it's an and problem, and you shade in between. If it's a greater than problem, it's an or problem. So same exact thing, except for the opposite. If you have 2x is greater than 10, now it's greater than, so it's a GOR. So greater than, the G stands for greater than, the OR means it's an OR problem. So this one, you're going to include the word OR, and again, the graph for this one is going to be the typical OR problem where they shade away from each other. Now again, if that doesn't make sense, you have to do it that way. You can graph just like normal, and you'll see how it's going to work out. But it is a good way to check over your work and make sure you're getting the right things with ands and ors and stuff of that nature. It's a good tool. It's not necessarily a necessity. So I just mentioned this, but just so you know, the typical and shading, now I put typical in quotes because again, I said this the other day where there's a lot of different ways to shade an and problem. But the typical way, for at least for this class, is when you have your 2 points and you shade in between those. So it doesn't matter if they're open or closed, but the typical and shading is in between. So if you ever have a less than, and if you want to jot this down, it's going to graph, it's going to look like that. The same problem is always going to look like that. Your typical or shading, again, we just talked about this the other day. I don't care if they're open or closed, but they're shaded away from each other. And again, that would be something like 2x is greater than 10 is going to end up looking like that graph. So again, the good news with this, if you remember this little trick, the land of Gore, if you remember that phrase, I feel like mnemonic device, I don't know what it's actually called. But if you remember that phrase, again, you can tell right before you even start if it's an and or or problem, and you can tell what your graph is going to look like. You still have to solve it to end up getting what the numbers are. Now, one of the reasons I do like it is, like I said, you catch your problems. But when I told you guys you have to flip your sign for your negative, to do that, I'll probably count half. Then your graph won't be wrong. I won't have to catch that point for not flipping your sign, and then I credit for your graph because your graph is correct. So that's one of the other reasons it's kind of nice. And again, if you think about it and check your work using that, it can kind of use yourself to check that and make sure you did that correctly. So, I'm putting on here. Apparently, I forgot to number those. We're starting 5. So that's okay. So the first two they're already solved for you. It's just getting used to what these answers are going to look like. So it's already it's an absolute value. It's already by itself. It's already on the left-hand side. So step 1 is done. Step 2, we're going to split into 2 equations. So we have x is less than positive 5, and then for our negative, you have to flip your sign. Without using the land of Gore, so you can kind of see where that gives you a shortcut. That you're graphing these. Now, so far, I don't know how to tell. I don't know if it's, I mean, you know, hopefully land of Gore, since we just went over that, you know. But since I'm not doing that yet, if you didn't know that, so far, I don't know if it's an and or an or problem. Graph this like normal. Make sure you put your times it. And I guess I should elaborate. Sometimes this is your lower number, sometimes this is your lower number. It all depends on the problem. Just make sure you graph the lower ones on the left. Then if you were to graph this would be an open circle. It says x, so I'd go to the right. This would be an open circle, x is greater than -5, so go to the, sorry, I said the right, went to the left. Do what I wrote, not what I say. The positive 5 goes to the left, the -5 goes to the right. Now again, I know we already went over problems that if this was an or problem, you couldn't get a graph like that. But we're going to ignore that for right now. We're talking about these typical problems. So the typical problem, if it looks like that, it's going to be an and problem. So my final answer is you need to make sure you go up and put an and here. So when I was in school, that's how I learned how to figure out if it was an and or an or. The whole problem, I had to graph the problem and say, oh, that's an and graph, so then go back and put and. If you remember the land of Gore, then you don't have to worry about these little, I mean, still. But by the way, this is a less than symbol. So we know land of Gore to the and problem. So before I did anything, I could tell it's and then in the graph, you don't have to worry. I mean, if you want to, you can do that graph like we did earlier, but you don't have to because you can just scribble in the middle. Since it's an and problem, that's how your graph is going to look. You don't necessarily need the land of Gore, and I will say the land of Gore by itself isn't quite enough because you still need to solve to find out what. But it is a really good way to help check your work a little bit, and it's a little bit of a shortcut if you remember it. So the next one, number 6. Same thing. This is a greater than, so this is a Gore problem. So before I even start anything, I usually put or somewhere, because then at least you have it on your paper and I can find it. But again, you put your 2 equations. So x is greater than 5, or x is less than -5. Remember, with that negative answer, you have to flip your sign. I will tell you, and I know some people may irritate because I'm indecisive. Please remember to do that. If you think of it, make sure you flip that sign. I don't want you to think, oh, I don't need to do that. But I'm very tempted that if you don't do that, but all your graphing is correct, and you have that it's an or problem, to just circle it and not calculate off. I haven't decided that, and I know some people think that's upsetting. But again, if you think of it, please do it. Then there's nothing really you can do. It happens. So again, your -5 is smaller. They're open circles. And again, an or problem means we shade away from each other. So that's a good example of using the land of Gore to then just have a couple of cuts. We don't have to worry as much about it. Honestly, if we're being true to each other, in my opinion, the solving part is the part, and we didn't solve really all in this one, but the solving part is the part you're going to have to worry about, or the part that I think is important. Any questions on those before we move on? On those, I mean, I say basic, but they're not basic. They're just the intro, I guess I should say. So let's go on to number 7. We do some of these solving problems. So again, one of the nice things is before I even start, it is a less than, and remember, less than means if you're reading it left to right, the absolute value is less than 40, pointing at that absolute value. Number 8, it is a greater than. Already, less than means and, that's the land of Gore. Greater than means or. If you have that on your paper, I'll probably give you at least partial credit, even if all the rest of it's blank, because at least you remembered that part. Solving, again, this is not much different than what we did before with the equal sign. There's just a couple subtle things you have to pay attention to. Next one is that you have to flip your sign with the negative answer. So once you remember that, flipping that sign, everything else you just solve like we did yesterday. 2 days ago, we did 5x is less than or equal to 55, divide both sides by 5. I get x is less than or equal to 11. Add 10, add 10. X is greater or equal to negative 35. Divide both sides by 5. X is greater or equal to negative 7. Now, last but not least, make sure you put that this is an and problem. As I talked about earlier, where if you put that here at the top, you put and. If you forget that, I'll still give you credit, because I can see you said it was an and. You just forgot to put it in your answer. But if you don't have, or if you don't have the word or at all, I don't know if you know which one you're talking about, so I'm going to have to make it. So, this one. 7 is smaller, your 11 is bigger. Now again, well, you can graph this like normal. If x is smaller than 11, from 11 you go to the left. X is bigger than 7, so negative 7 goes to the right. You shade where they overlap. Or, since I know it's an and problem, and again, I told you it's a typical and problem. There's no tricky one for this. So this is the answer. And that is the graph I'm looking for. On your homework today is, I don't have you do the graph, I just had you put the answer, because graphs are really hard to put multiple choice with. So before we go on to the next one, I will say, obviously, this is not easy. Certainly not. That said, I would argue the reason that it's difficult is just because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of little things to remember. So in my opinion, the math in this, there is solving in this. So yes, if you're not great at solving, then this is going to be a struggle. But if you're good at solving, the rest of this is just memorizing and making sure you know those little tiny things. Making sure you flip the sign with the negative. Making sure you know the land of Gore, that kind of thing. So the next one, again, the first step you have to do yourself. We've done that before. Getting 2 minus x equal to 18 divided by 3 is 6. Now, I'm one like this on the test that I've had. You divide by its negative, so you have to flip your sign. Later, you have to flip your sign when you get the negative answer, and then flip your sign again. So it is, again, there's a lot going on. I won't do one that's in that depth, but make sure you're paying attention to it. And again, it's one of those things that's not that hard. It's just hard to remember. So once we have that, we're going to split it up into our two equations. So 2 minus x is greater than or equal to 6. And 2 minus x is less than or equal to negative 6. Always flip the sign with that negative. And from here, subtract 2. Negative x is greater than or equal to 4. And again, now this is one of those where it's a little bit tricky, and it's not hard. It's hard to remember because there's a lot going on. But now I divide by -1. Since I divided by negative, you have to flip your sign back. Or you have to flip your sign, not flip it back. Sorry, I shouldn't have said it that way. Same thing with this other one. The good news is if you had to flip that sign, hopefully you remember to flip this one because it's going to be the same thing. We divide by -1. X is greater than or equal to +8. And this is an OR problem. So that's the first part of our answer. That's the hard part. I think, well, Mr. Stephan, since I flipped the signs, then it must not be an OR anymore. Because it wasn't OR, then we flipped it when we divided by. No, that's the beauty of this. You don't have to worry about that. My 4 is down here. My 8 is bigger than that. They're both filled in, and it's an OR problem, so they shade away. And if you don't want to take my word for it, you can actually graph these. The 4 is shaded to the left, shaded to the right. That's exactly what we have. Any questions on those? I will say this is one of those things that you'll have to look at your practice test, but I imagine on the test, don't lose a ton of sleep if you're terrible at these. If you have no idea how to even start them, then yes, you should study. You should make sure you know how to start them. But if you can't seem to get the right answer and you get confused, I think there's probably only 2 of these on the test. And again, as long as you can get it started and somewhat look like you a little bit know what's happening, I give you a lot of partial credit for that. Go ahead, do number 10 and 11. Honestly, the one thing I will say with this is a good example of one that you need a lot of repetition practice with this. So go ahead, do number 10 and 11 on your own. Pass out your practice test while you do this. It's going to take a while now. Also pass around a stapler so you can staple these together. stable here in a second. So let's send the stapler on so you can staple your practice test together. Again, I apologize. If you're a super environmental person, you're upset that I killed trees. I promise it was an accident. I promise I'll plant a bunch of trees this spring. My goal is over 100. So that should make up for this, provided they live. A minute or two on this one. All right. Then just putting the answer because it goes a little bit quicker. But I'll go a little bit quickly because you guys should have at least this first one down, most of the second one. But we have a little bit of time, and again, I want to make sure. So that's great. So we just split that into two. Right. Plus 6m is less than 33, and plus 6m is greater than or equal to negative 33. Do this at the beginning, but you don't really have to do it at the beginning, but this is an and problem because it's less than land of Gore. Again, L. From here, you solve both of these. And really, again, I don't know this, so you could probably go down and say, these are open circles, this is any problem, so it can be filled in. I don't know if those two numbers are yet, we have to solve for that, but if you want to get that out of the way, you can at this point. But again, if you do that, don't forget to put the numbers there. Both sides by 3, 6n is less than 30. Both sides by 6, n is less than 5. I subtract 3, I get 6n is greater than 6. Both sides by 6. And again, I always like to put it with my answer, but as long as you have the and written down somewhere, that's okay. But I do expect to see the word and or the word or in these answers. Then lastly, again, if you do it this way, don't forget you have to label these, and I will tell you, this is not good enough to just have it like this. Even though you have your answers here, because one of the mistakes a lot of people do is they put 5 here and negative 6 over here. So I need to make sure you know the smaller numbers go to the left, so the 5 goes on the right. Again, if you forget the land of Gore, it's not the end of the world because you can actually shade that like normal. To the right, the 5 is left, and then you have an and problem where they overlap, so then you can go back and put the and in there. And number 11. We have to be absolute value by itself first, so you need to multiply both sides by 5. That 5 cancels. We end up with 10b plus 5, absolute value, greater than or equal to 35. And now is where you split it up. The absolute value all by itself first, just like we did yesterday. So 10b plus 5 is greater than or equal to positive 35, and 10b plus 5 is less than or equal to negative 35. Now, again, I always forget this because I didn't do this till like 2 years ago. But this is a greater than problem, so it's or. Again, you don't actually need that until the very last step, but if you put it early, again, as long as you have it somewhere, that's going to be beneficial. These 5, 10b is equal to 30. If I go side by 10, b is greater than or equal to 3. And then the other side, do the same thing. Subtract 5. Again, make sure you pay attention to negative 35. Negative 35 minus 5 is negative 40. It's not negative 30. A lot of people do that with that problem. Divide by 10. B is less than or equal to negative 4. Again, it's an or problem. So my negative 4 is on the left, my 3 is on the right. And since it's an or problem, again, if you want to look more carefully, you can to double check. I would recommend it, but it's an or problem. They're shaded away from each other. I need to double check. B is shaded negative 4 shaded to the left. Now that I need to double check that. Is that stapler still moving around? Okay. If you don't staple them, it's not the end of the world, but probably beneficial for you guys. Whoever needs it. Whoever's closest. Honestly, the rest of the lesson, I'm going to go through fairly quickly because this isn't stuff that's necessarily on your test. The biggest thing, number 12, and there was actually one that ended up on your, wasn't on your test or your homework? There's one on your homework that ended up like this. I took it off because it was more confusing. But remember, I told you guys you have to get the absolute value by itself first. So for this one, you would divide both sides by negative 2. Well, since you divided by negative, you have to flip your sides. So you have to remember to flip it there. Stop, because you have on that problem, that's a little stop. On the other one that was on your homework, you had to flip it there, and then again, you ended up with a negative x, and you had to flip it later, so you had to flip it twice. And so it got a little bit confusing, although that would be a good extra credit question. I'll ponder that thought. So that's all I wanted to go through with that one. I'm not. And then again, the inequality special cases, the biggest thing with this one is just like the last one, realize, so before, the absolute value cannot be equal to a negative. An absolute value is always positive, so it can never be equal to a negative. That's true. So it's no solution. If you have an absolute value of anything is equal to a negative number, no solution. And then an inequality. So for this one, the biggest thing you have to remember is that the absolute value, the way I do this one, is the absolute value is always positive. So is a positive greater than negative 12? Yes, it is, and that's what it is all the time. A positive is the negative 12. So that was all real numbers. Last one, same thing. This is a positive because it's an absolute value. When is a positive less than a negative? Never. A positive will never be smaller than a negative. An absolute value will never be less than a negative. So that one is no solution. Which ironically, I didn't do it on purpose, but this one ended up being a negative. So technically, a positive is less than a negative. That one's no solution. I did not mean to do that, but that's okay. Anyways, and like I said, those aren't necessarily on the test. Those would also be good extra credit questions. We'll have to see. We'll have about a little over 10 minutes to work on your worksheet, do your homework checks. Don't work on your practice test yet because that's what I'm going to have you guys do tomorrow. Make sure you get practice with this because that's one of the big things. Again, I always have people that say, well, I'm just really bad at math, but then they don't do their homework. And that's a huge thing. You need to get practice with this. That's a big thing with math. If you don't know how to do something or if you're bad at it, it takes a lot of practice. That helps you memorize. That helps you get the flow and the rhythm down. It helps a lot. So make sure you're taking time to do that.